Welcome everybody. Thanks for coming tonight. Next week, Anna Hutlacker from Pediatrics will be here to talk about going forward in reverse. How does inflammation resolve? She was also professor in addition to the Department of Pediatrics, professor in the Department of Medical Microbiology and Immunology. June 8th, for the first time in 17 years, folks, we're going to talk on whales. Not the place that's north of Cornwall. Yeah.
What a shame.
It's our story.
What else has to be on
Allison Fleming, who's with the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology, will be here to talk about whale tails, ecological histories recorded in whale tissues, past and present. And on June 15th, Kenny Lee will be here from the Joshua Kuhn lab. You might have seen the paper that came out of their lab about 3 weeks ago about mass spec and how they're confirming that what they're getting, structures they're getting for proteins out of mass spec are actually accurate representations of the native protein, as we say in Latin, in vivo. Now we're going to do the formal stuff. So if you come up here, that would be great. And if you got your
My mic should be live now. Yes.
So I'm going to stand here so the Zoom can pick up, and so that, remember, this is the only microphone and the only camera.
Yes, I understand. I'm just mostly adjusting it so that you don't get the completely unflattering view on the Zoom, but right under my chin.
Yeah.
I know the feeling, especially the cords.
Yes, it's like really not the most attractive. But
We'll move on. Welcome everybody to Wednesday Night at the Lab. I'm Tom Zinnan. I work here at UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. I also work for the Division of Extension Wisconsin 4-H. And on behalf of those folks and our other co-organizers, PBS Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and the UW-Madison Science Alliance, thanks again for coming to Wednesday Night at the Lab. We do this every Wednesday night, 50 times a year. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Amy Gilman. She's the director of the Chazen Museum of Art. She's going to be speaking with us about COVID and the museum, how arts institutions are re-emerging in a post-pandemic world. Now I get to ask Amy the 5 questions that I ask everybody. She's completely uncued on this. Amy, where were you born?
Boulder, Colorado. My father, some of you are scientists, both my father and my stepmother worked for the National Center for Atmospheric Research.
Nice. What are what are the mountains called there? The flat iron?
The Flatirons, yeah.
Man. And that great Chautauqua's right there.
Yes.
And then where'd you go to high school?
I went to high school at Ball High School in Galveston, Texas.
It's not nice to laugh at people.
I was laughing at the change from Colorado to sea level.
Right.
And then where'd you go for your undergrad?
Okay, I had to say another Big 10 down the road. I was at Northwestern.
Very good. And what'd you study?
I studied theater. I was a performance major.
And then where'd you go for your advanced degrees?
So I have a photography degree, an MFA in photography from Columbia College in Chicago, and my PhD is from Case Western.
Whoa, Cleveland.
In Cleveland, yeah.
Very nice. And what's your PhD?
Art history with a focus on contemporary art.
Good stuff. And then you arrived here 5 years ago?
Almost exactly. So it'll be 5 years in September.
I'm looking forward to what you have to say. I'm going to do a little testimonial here.
Okay.
My mother-in-law, who's likely to be watching, used to live in North Adams, Massachusetts, which has a massive MoCA.
Yeah.
And the Clark Art.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the great things about visiting her was to go see those museums. And when she came here, I was very happy to walk her through your museum. And she thought it was pretty impressive, as do I. So it's great to have a fantastic art museum on campus. Everybody, would you please join me in welcoming Amy Gilman, Wednesday Night at the Lab.
Thank you. And thank you so much for welcoming me to this. And I feel like in the midst of probably maybe 49 weeks of very science and heavy material, this is like your visual art break, right? Which if you have seen any of the videos that we've done at the museum since I've gotten there, we actually call it going and having a Chazen moment. And we encourage everybody to, because we're free, right? Just like, you don't have to come down for 2 hours, right? If you're on campus and we're open, you should come for 20 minutes and just visit something. And if you're having a stressful day, I can highly recommend it. So thank you all for having me today. And I am going to talk a little bit about the museum related to COVID, because of course you clearly can't avoid that, since COVID has been with us for the last 2 years and has dramatically impacted our work, as it has with everyone. But I am going to, okay, the arrow command did not work. If I did this, no. Wait a minute, I'll try, nope. Yep, I think I got it. Okay, sorry. We'll get the tech hiccups out in the very beginning here. So what am I going to talk about today? We're going to talk a little bit about what milestones we were hitting pre-COVID, and then that will link into sort of how we've been emerging from the pandemic and how it's continuing to influence our work here. I'm also going to touch on some very specific current events in the museum field. I don't have any way of knowing how interesting this part is to you all, so if I touch on anything in my talk that you want me to come back to, just make a little note. We'll have time for Q&A at the end, and I'm happy to go into more depth, but I also didn't want to get too narrow at this particular talk. And then I'm also going to, if you don't already come to the museum, encourage you to come to some of our upcoming exhibitions and programs here. So what are we, right? So we're the University Art Museum for UW-Madison. We also, because Madison itself does not have a large civic museum, civic art museum, we have many museums in Madison, but not a civic art museum. We also sort of function as that space. We are the second largest collection in Wisconsin. We are the largest collecting, physically the largest collecting museum in the Big Ten. And we are open to the public 7 days a week, and we have free admission. So some of the things that had been accomplished prior to the pandemic, we had been conducting, beginning in September 2019, a big experiment. So I've worked in museums for over 20 years now, and there are some things that are just sort of normal in museums. Many of them close every day at 5 o'clock. Many of them close on Mondays. Okay, so let's just take those two examples. And when I got here, one of the things we started talking about was like, let's start questioning some of those norms, because it's not as if, you know, some sort of pantheon of museum gods like dictated that you can't be open on Mondays. What is that about? Right. And so we started asking in questions about it. And the answer that I got when I first got here to the question about Mondays was, well, museums aren't open on Mondays. And I said, well, you know, we are, I'm not sure why we're getting this echo. We are nested within a large educational institution that happens to have a lot of classes on Mondays and Wednesdays and Fridays. So like, why are we closed to the public? And so we started this big experiment. We got the university to really invest in the museum being open from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. 7 days a week. You'll see some of the statistics about that. And we were on track in that year to nearly double the annual attendance of the museum. The doubling attendance is not a goal, right? High attendance is not the goal. It is an effect of the change. So I just want to demonstrate to you that that did significantly increase the amount of engagement with the museum. We also worked very hard to significantly increase our staffing, because we've been pretty stagnant for a number of years. And it's a personal goal of mine, and was part of my brief when I got here, to increase the regional and national press coverage. And we had also, as part of this big change, basically gotten rid of the museum store as it was and had transformed it with a partnership with the Wisconsin Union into a coffee shop with a reduced retail footprint. Now, some people might decry the absence of a traditional museum store, but I can tell you that it was losing money. It had always lost money, and losing money on retail is not mission critical, right? We lose money on everything else, and that's no problem, right? But losing money on the thing you're supposed to make money on, not a good idea. So we reduced that by 4/5 of the footprint, but we were actually still making money. Now, by then, we'd actually stopped digging our hole and actually we make a little money every year. And we'd also increased the amount of giving to the museum. So this was the, like, we were intending to have this big experiment for a couple of years when we would then evaluate what we learned from the big 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., 7 days a week experiment, and we would then make some adjustments. And then, as you might imagine, the COVID hit. But in the meantime, we were really working on a specific kind of strategic plan, which had these 3 pillars to it. We wanted to align all of our resources. So I spent a lot of time when I first got here really looking at the museum's budget, looking at what kinds of endowments the museum has, and making sure that we were structured properly to be able to do what we said we wanted to do. We wanted to be able to make sure that the museum was actually going to be able to be sustainable, and sustainable for us is sometimes about green stuff. So we took the whole LVM building and put it on LED technology, for example, but it is also about whether the museum can survive going forward in a really healthy way. And then finally, the big driver of that change for the hours and other kinds of accessibility things is this idea of really increasing the amount of relevance for the museum to our communities. And our communities includes facing Madison and our regional community here, and dramatically increasing the level of engagement within the university itself. Well, obviously, here's the cafe and lobby that I mentioned. We've added chairs into the lobby. You can sit there and charge your laptop. You can come in and have a coffee. If you want to come in at the end of the day, you can have a glass of wine. And that has been very, very successful, and it has really changed the way people interact with the museum's lobby. So in addition to that, like basically that change, that hours change, was not something that when I got here, I thought we would be doing. It was something that was an outcome of those conversations I was talking to you about when we first got here. But it did dramatically change the profile of the museum nationally, because we could say that we were going to be the most open art museum in America, and nobody was doing what we were doing at the time. So that felt like a really great idea in September 2019. I'm not sure that I would have agreed to it if I had known what March 2020 was going to look like, but there you go. So in 2017, when I arrived here, we were open 48 hours a week. In September 2019, we were open 84 hours a week. That just, like, the numbers really show you like what the major changes were. But the other part of that change was that the UWPD provides security for the museum, as it should, because we have a highly valuable collection and really important buildings, et cetera. But that was, the officers were stationed at the front desk. They were manning all the galleries, and they were providing like wayfinding and things like that. And we created a new department, a visitor services department, that is made up of people who are trained in customer service, who are there to help you, welcome you to the museum and help you out. And this has actually, I think, improved the security in the museum, because the officers can now be behind the scenes and actually focus on security things, as opposed to helping you find out where the bathroom is, right? But also it means that the people that you see when you walk in the door to the museum are not uniformed officers. And there's nothing wrong with uniformed officers, but not everybody in the world finds that a welcoming space, okay? So if we want to break down barriers to people being able to come to the museum, we have to really meet people where the barriers are. So March 2020, we don't need to rehearse what actually happened at the time, but basically we shut down when everybody shut down, and we then reopened in July of 2020, which felt like an age to me at the time. And it was a tremendous push to do that. We were the first museum in Madison to reopen. And, but now I look back and I realize that so many of my colleagues didn't reopen their museum for a whole nother year. There were many museums that stayed closed until the following summer. Most of the nested museums I know embedded within other universities stayed closed for even a year or a year and a half. And as hard as it was for us to reopen at a time when we didn't really know how to do it, so what has come to be known as like, you know, the sort of cleaning theater that people do on the, that did early on in the pandemic on the surfaces and stuff. I mean, we were doing all of those things, right? But so it was really tough. It was because nobody had done this before. We had shut down. It was so dramatic, but it was super fast. But the opening up is not fast at all. It is really hard. It takes forever to be able to do it. And I mean, that was why I knew that when the university decided to go back in person, it was going to be like, there's like all of this chaos, right? Because I could see that, and it was in my little space, right? It was like all the things you have to do in order to make those decisions. But it did mean that we were open to the public at a time when many things were not open to the public. And in those first couple of weeks, I actually worked the floor. I, you know, signed up myself as a visitor services staff member and worked shifts on the floor, because if I'm going to ask people pre-vaccination to be in the public, like I also need to take that risk. So I actually was there when the first people came into the museum, and we required you to sign up, and we had limits and all of those things. And we only had a portion of the museum open. But oh my goodness, if you can go back and recall how restricted things were in July of 2020, and then imagine going to an art museum and like seeing something not on a Zoom, right? Seeing something real. And I just have to say that it was one of the experiences, like having this horrifying thing happen to the world. It's also been really clarifying about the importance of really understanding what we are in terms of being a museum. We have valuable technology, which is also driving this talk tonight, where we can be both in person and online. We should use this forever, right? We should continue to do this. But everybody craves that engagement with the real, right? Finding a way, and like, we had people sign up for the very first day, and they were so grateful to be in there. And you know what? You can distance no problem in my galleries, right? So it's not like going to the Met, right? Like you can actually distance. And get this, we have a very state-of-the-art building, which means that we filter for viruses. This was pre-pandemic, right? So like we have very good, like you can feel pretty safe, right? I'm not saying it's like perfect, but especially pre-vaccination, the more museums started opening up, the more we realized like how much people really needed to be able to get back into those kinds of spaces. So now, September 2021 came around, and we have largely reopened. We're back to 7 days a week. We're not back to the full 8 to 8 schedule. We did actually learn something from the 9 months that we were open, but we're up to about 57 hours per week. But we are still open 7 days a week. And now it's like 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. Monday through Friday, and then 12 to 5 on Saturday and Sunday. And that means that you don't have to be like, oh, is tonight the night the museum is open later, right? You can actually go most of the nights of the week. So coming out of the pandemic, the two major priorities for the museum are, we have a series of capital projects coming up, and I will not bore you with all of the details about this, but it is probably important for you to know, especially if you live in the region and you come to the museum. And more excitingly, really digging into reimagining what the University Art Museum is going forward. If you have seen the museum lately, you know that we have this super attractive chain link fence around the original building. And you can't go in through any of the entrances. And eventually that chain link fence will be replaced by scaffolding, which if you have seen the engineering building that's over here, like you've seen it wrapped basically in scaffolding, that's what the LVM building is going to look like, the original building. We're going to be doing the replacement of the elevator in that building. We have to remove all of the stone on the outside of the building and then reapply it. And then we're going to replace all the skylights in that building. And this will take us into 2024. So that's a lot of activity, a lot of disruption in the building. We're still trying to figure out how that's going to really work. But the exciting thing that we're doing is this idea of reimagining the University Art Museum. How do we integrate ourselves within the whole campus? How do we engage with departments that are not historically our natural partners? How can we support teaching and learning at the university? And think really about a fewer number of projects. So I know that might sound counterintuitive, but actually focusing on the ones that are high impact, right? And high visibility, because we are not a large team and we are serving a large community. So this includes a real focus on accessibility and inclusivity. We are continuing some of our online programming. We're doing a lot of things like this, where we're doing it in dual modes. During the pandemic, we launched a brand new website. We sort of did it quietly. It was already in process. It has made things much more, things are much easier to find on our website now. And we are really thinking about how to utilize the museum to think deeply about dialogue around race, equity, and access, and whether that is about the number of hours we're open, installing a hearing loop in our auditorium, which had never been installed, doing things like ensuring that we are extending our hours as we can so that people can come when they are ready to come and not just when we've decided because of history the museum should be open. One of the things that we're doing is we're taking the opportunity. Traditional museum docents had not been working, volunteering at the museum since March of 2020. And so we have not been touring since then. Most of the schools, in fact, I think we got our first request since March of 2020 for a tour from K through 12 schools, like back at like a month ago. So that's like the traditional docent program has been on hiatus. So we've taken this opportunity to reimagine that program, and we are now going to be paying museum guides to do tours. And we're putting together a mix of both community members and students. So it'll be a mixed cohort that will be training together. This means that it's part of our commitment to end unpaid labor at museums, which is in our field is absolutely endemic and a serious problem with equity. It is also a way for us to support teaching and learning at the university in a way that's very different. So the idea of an intergenerational cohort that learns together gives students opportunity to learn in very different ways as a job than they would otherwise. In addition to that, we're supporting teaching and learning in a wide variety of ways, including some curriculum creation. So for the fall of 2020, we experimented with actually creating some online curriculum modules so that we would just, as the faculty at the university was getting ready to be entirely virtual in the fall, that we would create modules that were flexible enough. They weren't specific to art history, they were actually thematic, right? So one on sustainability that different faculty could pull, and it's all entirely virtual. But then because we were open some hours by that point, we also made sure that a lot of that artwork was on view. So professors and students who were here could actually go to see works, and it was a way for people to engage with real objects at that time. It meant that we were doing pilot projects for, in that year, the Go Big Read, which was Parkland. and really did a deep dive with 2 Wisconsin Experience courses. And it was really an incredible experiment. And it's something that we haven't continued with the online curriculum, but what we have done is like you leverage what we learned from this in order to really think about how we're going to approach working with faculty going forward. So a little bit about some current events in my field. So some of these things that are sort of headlines here, you might have seen them. They might either look familiar in some way. I would argue that the headline, "The pandemic may have killed the Blockbuster exhibition," as he says, is a good thing. I've been waiting for that to die. I mean, I love Impressionism as much as the next person, but like you really just do not need another giant Impressionist exhibition to travel to the big places, but not really to engage with smaller museums. 2 other major things that's happening right now in the field. So part of was called the Great Resignation, but what I call the Great Reevaluation, right? So there's a lot of people who are thinking about their relationship with their jobs. And this is true in the museum field too. And part of that is related to historically low pay in many positions within the field, or no pay, as I mentioned before, and kind of acceptance across the field that that there wasn't any way to change this, and that bad behavior from managers or leaders was just part of just doing what you love by being able to work in a museum. And that is over. Like, we are done with that, right? Consequently, more museum workers are organizing at many museums around the country. Just off the top of my head, I can tell you that there are serious organizing movements that have happened at the Milwaukee Art Museum, Philadelphia, Kansas City, Nelson Atkins Museum. The Guggenheim was already unionized, and I'm trying to think about like all the different ones. So there are tons of them, and more grow every day. And that is really in response to the fact that there was like a tipping point, right? For many museums, especially big civic museums, at the beginning of the pandemic, man, everybody just decided that there was about to be a depression, and we had to cut our losses super fast, and they laid a lot of people off. And a lot of those people are the people on the front lines of the organization who are the lowest paid with the least amount of security. And consequently, when they all started being hired back, right, there's a change in the relationship between the workers and the museum. But in addition to that, there's this huge amount of churn that's happening at the top of the organizational chart. And by that, I mean at the director level. So the Design Museum has just, in New York, has just hired its 11th director in 8 years. It's kind of ridiculous. At some point last fall, there were 30 museum director positions of note that were open in the country. And that is a combination of a generational shift that had already started within the field, but also then some museum directors who were getting closer to retirement. The COVID just pushed them over, right? They're like, I'm done. And then finally, also there were a number of museum directors who were forced out for bad behavior, right? And that is part of what I was talking about before. So we are taking the equity problem within the field really seriously. And I think it's a real privilege to be at an institution like the Chazen, nested within the university, because we have a lot of resources to be able to think about these things. Doesn't mean I have huge amounts of resources on my own, but it does mean that I could come in here and say things like, no unpaid internships, right? I don't care what anybody says, any student says about whether or not they're able to work for no money. No student works here and doesn't get paid. If you can't do it without making it free, you cannot afford to get the work, right? So that was like an easy thing for me to do, because if we're not going to support students and we're here, what are we doing, really? But then also we're doing things like increasing the museum's open hours. We're starting the museum guide program. We're really trying to reimagine the museum's permanent collection installation over the next number of years so that we can tell the whole story of our collection better and also as a better teaching tool. And finally, it means that we are doing projects like something called the Reemancipation project. So the object that you see here with this gentleman, Mark Hines, in front of it, scanning it, is a piece in the museum's collection called the Emancipation Group. And it stands about, I mean, you can sort of see the scale because Mark is standing there. And it's a marble and it's very traditional. It was made in the late 19th century and has been in the museum's collection since the mid 1970s. There are several versions of this sculpture around the country. There are two large bronzes in public spaces, or were in public spaces. One of them is in Washington, D.C., and it is still there. And one of them was in Boston, and it was taken down at the end of 2020. So there are other marbles like ours, and then there are other small bronzes. And we have decided that we want to engage that question about how can museums really help think about difficult topics. But not just say, we're going to talk about race. We're going to talk about the history of slavery. We're going to talk about representation. No, we are about objects. We care for objects. So we are going to take a deep dive into this single object. And we've engaged with an artist, his name is Sanford Biggers, as one of our collaborators. And he brought on this team of people who have started working with us. And we're combining some really exciting new and old technology, if you will. So what Mark is doing here is the 3D scanning. If you read the article in the newspaper the other day about the engineering department doing the 3D scan of the large canoe that came out of Lake Mendota, like, this is the same technology, basically, that we are using with this. And it creates this incredibly detailed scan, which we now have on our website. So if you're interested, it's called Reemancipation, no colon in it for that, .org. And now that we have that really detailed scan, we're actually going very old school. The most traditional, the most old school art historical way of analyzing an object is through iconography. So taking the individual parts of it and telling you, like, what do those mean? And so we now can really literally pull them out so that you can see the Lincoln figure by himself. You can actually take apart the post and the paper and sort of all of that, and you can actually look at them individually. And that's been super exciting to see. And we are going to have an exhibition of this process that we have been going through beginning next year. Through about this time next year through the end of May. And we also have a website that will feature a lot of the details that I've just been talking about, a public symposium series. We're partnering with the UW School of Education to develop curriculum around this object. We're partnering with the School of Engineering to do 3D printing, because you can see, right, that figure right here in the center. This is the 3D printed version that came out of the engineering makerspace. Yay, engineering. Where the formerly enslaved gentleman is now standing. And you can even just see in that simple change how it changes the tenor of the piece. In addition to that, we have been filming this whole process. And we've been inviting artists from dance, from music, from all kinds of other media to come into the space and respond to the work. And we're going to have a documentary produced about what it means to be a museum that takes this kind of dive into this object. And how do we do that? Because coming out of COVID, we really need to figure out how to museum going forward. So I'm going to finish by showing you just a few things that are coming up at the museum or are currently on view so that you can, I hope, be enticed to come to the building. If you have not been over to the original LVM building, you do have to go through the Chazen right now to get to this. You must go see this installation. It's called Suspended Landscapes, and it's by an artist by the name of Amanda McCaver. It closes in September. And it is like a garden hanging from the 4th floor skylights, right? And it is There are many pictures online. It does not do it justice, even though they are stunningly beautiful. They hang 40 feet down. So you can see them when you stand in what's called Page Court right there, you actually see them from below and looking up. Then as you go onto the second floor, you actually see them right in front of you. As you go up to the next floor, you actually see them both in front of you, and then down. It just completely changes the space. It's so remarkable. And she did this, it was supposed to be for September 2020. By all of those plants that she's doing there are native to Wisconsin. And she did this by going to the UW Herbarium and taking a close look at that collection. So I really have to shout out, right, to our colleagues here at the university who were so in the botany department and at the herbarium, who were so welcoming to this visual artist to come in and do these highly detailed drawings, et cetera. And then that was created, these small embroideries, and then these large prints were done. Also next year, we're going to have a wonderful landscape exhibition at the end of the calendar year about Wisconsin's landscape. So that should be quite engaging. In the fall, we will be hosting an exhibition that we are not curating, but is a part of the university's public history project. So if you are not aware of the Public History Project yet, it is an initiative that, if you would recall, back in 2017, 2018, the Chancellor commissioned a study and white paper about the history of the Ku Klux Klan on campus. And one of the outcomes of that paper was, actually, there's a lot of the university and Madison's history that is not well known, and we shouldn't stop at this, right? It should be more known. And the Chancellor agreed and funded a 3-year public history project to delve into the university's archives to tell stories about the history of the university that are not as well known. And with the intention, always from the get-go, that there would be a public exhibition, and that exhibition will be this fall at the Chazen Museum. And next spring, we have the opportunity to borrow a single object, this incredible painting from Artemisia Gentileschi, Lot and his daughters, which will be on loan from the Toledo Museum of Art, which is where I worked prior to coming here, for several months. Now, why would we borrow only a single object? Well, this is an example of what happens when I start to get to know parts of the community that I wasn't aware of, and I have gotten involved with, and I have come to know quite well the Forward Theater Company, that's one of the resident companies at Overture. And I happen to know that they have just recently announced that they are world premiering a play next spring about Artemisia Gentileschi. And so we decided, since we don't have one, if we could borrow one, it would be a really unusual and wonderful way to partner with another organization. So I'm going to leave it here and open it for questions. And maybe what I'll do is stop screen sharing so that you're not all looking at me in the Zoom. There we go. Okay, hello. So now I'm happy to answer questions. I know I sort of went through a lot of different things. I can tell you that you can ask me questions about anything, things that I talked about, things that you are curious about, whether I covered them or not. I'm happy to try to answer questions about the museum.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the reopening in the fall of 2020, because that's something that was of great concern to me. You mentioned you thought there were some advantages to reopening the museum that early. I guess there's probably nothing anybody could argue with that, but the chancellor at that time was pushing to reopen the whole campus, and it was clearly premature time to have done that. Personally, I think she was criminally negligent, and as a result, of course, of these massive having to quarantine students in the dorms for long periods of time. So I guess basically I'm just raising my concern that reopening the campus in 2020 was something that was seriously premature and irresponsible. Thanks.
Thank you. I don't have any commentary about about opening of the whole campus, but let me just talk a little bit about the decision making that went into the July reopening of the museum, which was one of the few things on campus that was allowed to reopen at the time. And we were only allowed to reopen after I put together a 25-page proposal that outlined what we were going to do to ensure that people would be safe in the space, and how would we make sure that people were able to keep distance, and also going through specific staff's training to ensure that we also were able to handle any issues that came up with people who, for example, didn't want a mask, which at the time was required. And obviously pre-vaccination was also imperative, right? I felt at the time, and I still do, that we were able to, partly because we live where we live, that I knew we were not going to be overrun with people. We were at a moment where we could, in a very limited way, provide people with something outside of their homes that would be safe for them to do. And as long as I felt that we were going to be able to keep the staff safe, and there were no COVID transmissions between staff or from visitors to staff or from staff to visitors, right? During, like, as far as I know, ever, but during this period, is that we also, I will just say, like, if you came down during this period, like we had like 2 galleries open. I mean, like the poor people who came back, like they were so delighted to be in the building, but we actually had only at that time the first floor and the second floor open of the Chazen building. And then we eventually reopened part of the 3rd floor of the Chazen building, and we never reopened the LVM building because we knew we actually couldn't control it that much. Because once you reopen the LVM building, you actually have to open like the gates, like, so I wouldn't be able to control like who was in the building. And I was never worried that we were going to be like, again, like overrun with people, but I also wanted the team to feel safe. That is the decision that we made. That is the decision that I advocated for. And partly, I will say, I advocated for that change, like the reopening at that time. Well, just that we be allowed to reopen, and that we be allowed to open beyond the university community. And we were, I believe, for at least 6 months, the only place on campus that was allowed to have non-university people in the building. And that was really important to me because we also serve the Madison community, right? So you can argue that maybe that was not a safe decision, but I was working with the information that was available to me at the time. And it actually felt at that moment like it was a really, like that we could do it in a way that was very thoughtful. And because my museum is dramatically smaller scale than the rest of the university, I can control the environment pretty significantly. So, yeah, we have a question right down front here. I don't know if we have anybody on.
The study collection, the things that I used to visit upstairs where you have a lot of things on the wall and notebooks of descriptions. Is there any plan to make accurate 3D copies that can actually be handled?
So, okay, so thank you for asking this question, because part of the Reemancipation project, right, is the 3D scanning that we're able to do. When they came here last summer and scanned the Emancipation group, they also scanned about 25 other objects in the museum's collection from a variety. So sculptures from different parts of the world, Russian icons, right, like big range. And now that we have access to that, and now that we have started developing this relationship with engineering, which didn't exist before this, is we have started a conversation about being able to 3D print something, 3D print some of them so that you can handle that, right? And how would we make that accessible to people? So I don't have a plan for you yet, but I think we have almost unintentionally made that more likely now because we are doing this project that has that kind of outcome. Yeah.
A couple questions that you have there in the chat.
Sure. So we've got, all right, so I've got one that says, how do you allocate your space to exhibit, say, on history, contemporary issues, environment, and so on? So I will say that we do not allocate our space by issues because we are an art museum. We have historically focused on displaying groups of objects roughly in chronological order. This is a little getting a little in the weeds, but you know, if you go into like the original LVM building, that is where the old master paintings are, and the ancient art is, and the American paintings from the early 20th century. But when we start thinking over the next couple of years about reimagining the way we install the whole collection, we're actually looking for some themes that we can run through a lot of these objects, because that's also predominantly how faculty would teach from the collection, right? So that is something, part of the way we allocate the space is like what we have strengths in. So there's a heavy emphasis on 20th century and contemporary artwork because that's what we have a lot of right now. And then I have another question here. How does the Chazen make decisions about new acquisitions? And are there hidden treasures which you're planning to reveal? Well, I would hardly be appropriate for me to tell you over the secret Zoom. One thing I will mention about the sort of secret treasures is that there's an initiative we've been doing. It's actually sort of largely happened during the pandemic. That is a contemporary African art collection that we have been building intentionally over the last several years. And if you go to the museum right now, in the lobby of the museum is this stunning life-size bronze of this woman, and it's called the Sower, S-O-W-E-R. And so she has a basket of seeds that she is actively throwing out. And that collection, and there's about, I think, over 25 or so objects now, has been built, and some of them are installed, but some of them we haven't put out yet because we're going to have a big exhibition in the fall of 23 that we hope will also travel. And it's a collection that's unique to us. We didn't get this collection through a donation of a whole collection. We actually got it because of two now former faculty members at the university, Scott Strauss and Sarah Geyer. Scott was in political science and Sarah was in English, and they're now out at Berkeley. Their family foundation funded this over multiple years with the intention of us building a whole collection of contemporary African art. And it's gonna be something that's really is transformational of the galleries. And how do we make decisions about new acquisitions? Well, this is a long and involved process, as you might imagine. And it depends somewhat on, you know, most of what we acquire is gifted to us. We do have a small amount of funds to be able to acquire through purchase. Just as an aside, no state money has ever been used to purchase artwork for the museum in the history of the museum. And so there's a pretty involved process to make the decisions about that start with curators and then goes to the chief curator and then comes to me. And then eventually a group of objects is presented to the acquisitions committee, which includes donors, faculty from the university, and then it's presented to the regents because the collection is actually owned by the regents of the University of Wisconsin system. And I think that was the last of the questions that was on there. Is there one more? Okay, sorry. Just see if there's anything else. Oh, what kind of trainings will the new visitor guides undergo? So we're working this out now, but one of the things that we are planning on doing with the visitor guides is that in the museum field, the touring has moved in the last 15 to 20 years from a kind of professorial style, a la what I am doing right now, to much more of an engagement style. So really trying to, having lots of facts and things at your disposal, but really engaging with visitors and tours to help them look closely at the artworks and help them understand them, not by giving them lots of information by reciting it, but actually by soliciting that information through a dialogue with them. And that will be a lot of what that training will entail. So yes.
Hi. You seem to indicate the Reemancipation statue that they were 3D scanning, that having the slaves stand was a minor thing. I find that a real major thing.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think I must have misspoken. The movement is minor. The idea of just making one change to the sculpture. The effect is profound.
Yes, I found it very.
Okay, yeah. So I'm sorry if that came across that way. That was not my intention.
The slave was moved from a supplicant to an equal.
Yes. Yes. So yes, thank you for drawing that out. And I really appreciate you bringing that up, because I would not want you to leave with the impression that I think that change is minor. What I really meant to imply there is that the artist, Sanford, after he got those scans, he was like, the first and most natural change is to equalize the figures, right? So like, let's have him stand. And that's just one change. And that's the only change that got made in that version. And you're right, it profoundly changes the piece. And you can imagine what it would be like if it was large, right? Now, that original, so our marble version was made in 1895, I think. And the bronze version, the very large bronze version that's in Washington, D.C. was the original that was made. And that version is still in Washington, D.C. And that version was, if you can believe this, paid for by freed enslaved people. And Frederick Douglass attended the unveiling of that statue in Washington, D.C. And very interesting, because that object is, if you spend time with it, like, it is super problematic, right? Like it feels really difficult from a contemporary perspective. And that was present in Douglas's response to that sculpture at the time, right? Was this, like, the first thing that he said was like, I'm going to paraphrase here, but basically like, I will know that things have changed when the Black man is not kneeling, right? And so I think that the fact that that was the critique at the time, and it is one of the critiques today, really just tells you something about not only the history of the work, but the opportunity that museums have to take this very, very close look at this single object and really unpack it, like go super deep and super narrow, right? But because we go super deep and super narrow about this single object, we can talk about really, really big, difficult issues because we're grounding it in something physical. It's not just, oh, we're going to talk about politics or how you feel about this controversial issue in the country or whatever. We're actually going to ground it in the thing. And that is one of the things that's the opportunity for museums that I see going forward, that like, it's not about museums being political. It's actually about us engaging, and this is why being at a university is awesome, engaging in the discussions that are important at this time, right? And using objects to help us do that in a way that feels like it actually makes the conversation deeper and more fruitful and not just pounding at each other.
No, it's not in your collection, but it is at the library of the law school, and that's John Stuart Curry's Freeing and Slaves.
Yes.
Given the prominent point of position, what's your take on that painting?
Well, there are a number of depictions of Lincoln around this campus, as you might recall. And Lincoln himself is not an unproblematic figure, right? As many of the men of his time, men, who were in politics, especially at the time. That particular mural that's in the law school, we have actually worked a little bit with the law school to give them an analysis as well of some of the history of that mural and some of the elements, not quite as deep as what I'm talking about with the Emancipation group, but to help them also contextualize that piece and make some decisions about it. I personally, in an art museum, am not ever, I'm not going to take the Emancipation group off view, because removing it from view is not an option. It's part of our collection. But I do think that when you have objects in public spaces that are not sort of museum context, you do have to think about, like, how are people receiving this when they walk into the space? What do they see when they see the image there? Because you say that it depicts Lincoln, and it does.
No, not the one in the school, law school.
Oh,
The mural is the Freed Slave. It's on a par with John Brown.
oh, I'm sorry. I misunderstood your question. I'm not actually that familiar with that piece, I'm afraid. Yeah.
We'll talk later, by the way, we'll go out to beer after. Anybody around here? Thank you guys. Anybody else have any questions?
What's the other thing?
Since I work for Wisconsin 4-H, and we have like, I think we peaked out at 9,000 adult volunteers, lost some during COVID. What options for your docent group, which numbered several hundred, do you foresee now that you're switching over to the idea that every person will be paid? What do you plan to offer for volunteer folks who want to contribute their time and talents to the museum? So
I want to just correct something. We did not have hundreds of volunteers. We had there are probably about 60 docents who were on our rolls, and about 25 or 30 of them were active, just to be clear. I don't know yet what kind of volunteer capacity there is. I think that my priority at the university, so many of the things that could be volunteer positions, if you will, within the museum, because we are a university art museum, I actually feel like it's incumbent on me to actually utilize those kinds of positions as learning experiences for students. So that's a high priority for me. It doesn't mean I'm not interested in engaging the community in how they might like to volunteer, but as of the moment, we do not have the capacity to supervise volunteers. Thank you.
Other questions? If not, thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for joining us online.